Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Upskill. We are so excited to have you here and to have you join myself and Marc Brackett for a conversation on creating more emotionally intelligent workplaces. So I'm going to do a quick intro to Marc and turn it over to him. There's a lot of amazing stuff that's coming from the work that he's doing. So I want to give you a little bit of background on who Marc is, and then a little bit about how I found him, and we will get rocking and rolling. So Marc is the founder and director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. He's also a professor in the Child Study Center of Yale University. He is the developer of something called Ruler, which you'll probably hear a lot more about today, so get ready for that. And it's an evidence-based approach to social and emotional learning that has been adopted by nearly 2,000 pre-K through high schools across the US and other countries. The work Marc is doing is, of course, not just in schools, but his focus has been there, and you'll probably hear a little bit more about his passion around that. It's a really amazing story. So Marc is here today to help us all become more like emotion scientists, right? So more like emotion scientists and less like emotion judges. And you'll hear what that means as well. This is one of my favorite concepts from his book. Marc's book is called Permission to Feel. And Permission to Feel came out in 2019. There's Marc. And I first heard about Marc on his episode with Brene Brown last year, where they talked about why it's so important for us to understand and recognize that emotions are the most powerful thing, the most powerful current in our relationships, at work, at home, and everywhere else. And then how we can actually work to regulate them as we move through the process of wanting to become better versions of ourselves. So Marc is going to share all about that today. And Marc, I will hand it over to you and can't wait to hear what you're going to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you for trusting me and not sharing my PowerPoint with you in advance. That's scary. Excited to be here, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at, or good evening maybe. So as you heard, my name is Marc Brackett. My day job is I'm a professor at Yale, and I'm the founder and director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. I'm also co-founder of OG Life Lab, which is an organization dedicated to teaching emotional intelligence in the workplace. And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. So my title is Creating Emotionally Intelligent Ecosystems at Work, from Theory to Practice at LinkedIn. And we're going to jump right in. I like to start my presentations with a quote. For many of us, it's a year now that we've been working in quarantine, in isolation. Life turned upside down for most of us last March. And so Haruki Murakami. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain. When you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. So I'm just going to ask you to take a moment, reflect on that. What comes to mind for you? What does it make you think about? I'll share, what comes to mind for me is, as a scientist, a couple months ago, I did a study with my colleagues on gratitude. And I was really curious, what are the things that people are grateful for these days? And unsurprisingly, people said their homes, their finances, food. But what was very surprising to me was what was not there. Literally less than 1% of respondents said anything like healthcare workers, teachers, delivery people who come to bring us our packages each day. And so for me, one of my kind of takeaways from this pandemic is that gratitude is not cliche, for one, but two, a different appreciation for people that are behind the scenes. How about for you? Now, as you learned, the title of my presentation is about emotional intelligence. So that probably means I should ask you how you're feeling. And the funny thing about this is that a lot of people like to, when I start a presentation, they always say something like, hey, Marc, well, how are you feeling? And I typically say things during this last year. That's my job to ask you. I'm not answering that question right now because I'm emotionally bankrupt. Maybe you can give me a quick virtual raise of hands. How many of you are like slightly emotionally bankrupt from the last year? It's been tough. Putting that aside for a moment, we're here, right now. It's 11:37 a.m. Eastern Time. This is a tool we call the mood meter. So I'm going to ask all of you to take a moment and just think about how you're feeling. The mood meter breaks our feeling states into two axes or dimensions. Pleasantness. You woke up this morning, you've been working. What's your brain saying right now? This is going to be a great afternoon. This is going to be a crappy afternoon. I feel highly pleasant. I feel unpleasant. What's your number on the pleasantness axis? On the energy axis, it says 1 through 5, -5 to +5 as well. The job here is to think about your body. What's your mental and physical energy like right now? Do you feel like jumping into bed and pulling the covers over your head and disappearing? Or do you feel energized? Obviously, we cross our axes to create our 4 colors of the mood meter: yellow, red, blue, or green. So big question for you. What color are you in right now? Yellow, red, blue, green. Better yet, what's your precise feeling word right now? What's the word that best describes how you're feeling in this moment? Now, if you're like the other 500,000 people that I've presented to in my career, you're probably saying something like, it's a little bit harder to come up with a word. And what we know from research is that it is hard for many of us because we haven't had an emotion education. Typically, what happens? Someone says, how you feeling? You say fine, and you move on, right? If you were asking me how I'm feeling right now, and I were to say, well, I have this odd mixture of anxiety, frustration, overwhelmed, and I'm a little irritable. Like, what do you do with that at work, right? You're like, wait a minute, I just want you to say fine so I can go back to what I'm doing. You can go to do what you're doing. Does this resonate with people? I think the other thing about this question of how are you feeling is that it's a loaded question, because if I ask you the question, what does that mean? It means I actually want to hear what you have to say, maybe. And then I have to be prepared to listen to what you share, and then even be prepared to support you if it's not something like fabulous. Think about it again. You ask me how I'm feeling, like, fabulous. You're like, great. I don't got to do anything. But as soon as we share unpleasant emotions, which we know many people have been feeling over the last year, all of a sudden there's like a job that has to be done. Oh, so much work. I could ask you another question. What's going to be your emotion regulation strategy to get the most out of my presentation? If you notice yourself getting distracted, it's like, how many Zoom presentations, team meetings have you been on? Right? It's like another one. It's like you can triple dip. You're on like doing phone messages, text messages. You're on your computer doing emails, listening to something in the background. So many of us are so distracted, right? So what's your strategy to get the most out of this next hour? What will you do to experience the most pleasant emotions to support you in this learning process? We'll talk a little bit about that too. This is your cheat sheet. So this is the inside cover of my book, where I give you 100 feeling words. And we have an expression in our center that you have to name it to tame it. And I'll share more about what that means throughout the presentation. But as you can see here, there are a lot of words that we could use to describe our feelings. One thing you should know is the research we've done has literally shown that the world is pretty anxious right now. Can you relate to that? The number one word used by tens of thousands of people across the United States: anxiety. And I thought, what about supervisors? What about managers and leaders? Guess what? Anxiety, number one feeling word that people in management and leadership positions are also saying they're feeling. When we say, well, how do you want to feel? Everybody just says happy. Any thoughts on why happy is the number one word? Maybe because there's been 5,000 books on happiness. I think it's the easiest word. It's what comes to mind. But what really is happiness? And another question is happy something we should be striving for? We'll talk about that too. What I think is really interesting is if you pull out happy, what do you notice that's underneath it? respected, appreciated, supported, valued. Does that resonate with anyone, especially at work, that during these very difficult times, that feeling respected, appreciated, supported, valued, fulfilled, like that could matter? I think it does. Going back to the mood meter, what we notice is something interesting. We've got the real world living heavily in that red and blue. When we ask people, well, how do you want to feel? They're all telling us they want to be in that yellow and green of the mood meter. But the question is, how realistic is that? Can we just like cut out the anxiety that we've all been feeling and the worry in our heads? You know, here I am as a director of a center for emotional intelligence. And the truth is, I've had a lot of anxiety over the last year. To be honest with you, I've had a lot of anxiety for my 51 years of existence. But can you just get rid of it and say, I'm gonna park that anxiety over there and then just be happy over here? Probably not. What's also really interesting is that we can actually feel multiple feelings at the same time. Now, what is the vision of the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and why does it matter for all of you? Well, our goal is to use the power of emotions to create a healthier and more equitable, innovative, and compassionate society. What I assert in my work is that it starts with this very simple principle, which I call permission to feel. So I'm going to ask all of you to take a moment and reflect on that concept for a moment. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to give yourself the permission to feel? What does it mean to give the people you love and care for, your colleagues, the permission to feel? When you think about someone who grants themselves that permission to be their true, full feeling selves and gives other people that opportunity, what are the characteristics of that person? Well, of course, I've done research on that too. And here are the characteristics that come about. People say compassionate. Number one, empathic, non-judgmental, supportive, validating, caring, accepting, unconditional love. So I'm going to ask all of you right now to take a moment and reflect on these concepts. During the last year of this craziness, have you been self-empathic? Have you been self-compassionate? Have you been non-judgmental about what's gone on for you? What would be your score on a 1 to 5? 1, not very self-compassionate. 5, highly self-compassionate. What about for the people that you live and work with? How compassionate, empathic, non-judgmental have you been with them? You know, especially during transition times, right? These concepts, I think, can come in really handy because everybody's reaction to different transitions is different. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. This idea that every experience evokes an emotion, but we don't all experience the same emotions because of the same things. That's complicated at some level, but at another level, it's very freeing because it just makes us all be good listeners as opposed to good knowers or bad knowers. You know, I said that the goal can't be to be happy. And maybe some of you are like, why not? I want to be happy. And it's not that happiness is not a good thing. It's just that it's something that's a little difficult to strive for all the time. Because if you wake up every morning and think to yourself, what am I going to do today to be happy? What research shows is that you're going to likely feel less happy over time because that constant striving backfires. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's like it's hard to wake up and be happy every day when things are not going so great in the world around us. Maybe, just maybe, the goal can be striving for well-being. Think about that. Also, and importantly, from an emotional intelligence standpoint, there's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. What emotional intelligence has to do with is acknowledging and accepting all emotions. Right? As all of you know, to be successful in your careers, you're going to feel stress. So emotional intelligence can't be about like just being happy and getting rid of all your stress, because like I don't know how to teach you how to get rid of your stress, but I can help you learn strategies on how to manage stress successfully, how to modulate. I think another piece here is that historically, negative emotions were seen as disruptive, right? So Stoic philosophers would say things like, rule your feelings or they'll rule you. Emotions are idiosyncratic impulses that drive you to make poor decisions. Well, emotional intelligence is just the opposite of that. What we argue very clearly and through great research is that emotions are data. Emotions are information. They guide our thinking. As a matter of fact, a little bit of anxiety is helpful. Keeps you on your toes, makes you alert of what's going on in the world. Being very kind of laissez-faire, like it doesn't keep you kind of on your toes. In bullying situations, when there's injustices in our world, empathy alone is not sufficient. It's anger and empathy that make the difference in terms of action. So anger, as some people call it, as a destructive emotion, I don't see it as a destructive at all. I see anger as a very useful emotion in the right time and the right place. So now the science. Why do emotions matter? Why do all emotions matter? There are 5 reasons. The first, attention, memory, and learning. How many of you had trouble focusing during the last 6 months, especially like, let's say April, when everything was shutting down, the economy was tumbling, we were all freaking out about grocery shopping, and there was no toilet paper or paper towels in our country. Like, I don't know about you, but I had trouble focusing. We know that our emotions are the drivers of that. The second, decision making. Anyone here make a bad decision over the last couple of months or year? Oftentimes, we don't think of our emotions being influential in our judgments, but what research shows is that how we feel shifts the way we see the world, which in turn influences the judgments that we make. So you heard earlier that my work is in schools, research-wise, and we've done studies where we randomly assign teachers to be in a good mood or a bad mood. It's pretty simple. Think about a good day, think about a bad day, write about it for 5 minutes, and then we give every teacher the same essay to grade. Lo and behold, 1 to 2 full grade differences in the way the teacher evaluates the exact same essay. Then we ask the teacher, do you believe that how you felt had any influence over the grade? No way. What are you talking about? I grade papers all the time. So what that tells us is that our emotions literally influence the judgments that we make, but it happens outside of conscious awareness. Think about this in your work life. Anybody here ever get an argument at home in the morning over breakfast or whenever it was with your kids, with your significant other, with your dog? And you're like ruminating about it, you're perseverating over it in your car or in the commute, and you get to work and you're asked immediately to make a judgment about something or evaluate something. Well, what you should know is that how you were feeling there can leak into your judgment over there. One of the top antidotes to that problem is, guess what? Self-awareness, which we'll talk about in a moment. Third is relationship quality. Has anyone here ever worked with someone who is difficult? Like you have to walk on eggshells when they come into the room and get nervous about what you're going to say because they're going to be activated really easily, and just like there's a lot of effort into maintaining their relationship. Well, it's because of the way the person made you feel in the end, right? It's their facial expression, it's their body language, it's their vocal tone, it's their behavior. Emotions are signals. When we're looking at people's facial expressions and body language, they say approach, avoid. How we feel on the inside sends messages. Approach, avoid. Mental and physical health. Here's interesting research. The culture and climate of your organization will lead you to experiencing more or less pleasant or unpleasant emotions, which will lead to physical health challenges if it's more unpleasant. We found in one study that the culture and climate of a company affects stress, frustration, other unpleasant emotions and literally led to higher body mass indexes. That's body fat. So there are individual emotions, and then there are collective emotions on our teams and in our organizations, which can influence literally our physical health. Performance and creativity. As someone who is in a privileged place now, I work at Yale as a professor. I have the opportunity to teach some of the brightest crayons in the box. Every one of my students had higher SAT scores than I ever had. The only difference is I get to grade their papers. But I think what's interesting to me is that I just had this assumption going into working in this environment that every single student, because of their grades and their test scores, would be highly successful. Meanwhile, half of our students have mental health challenges like anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, not everybody does achieve their dreams. And the reason why that is that our general cognitive ability can go just so far, right? It might get you in, but it doesn't get you out. And what we're finding over and over again is that the emotional intelligence skills, especially in the workplace, are those skills that are the differentiator. Having the difficult conversation, giving and receiving feedback, inspiring a team, being creative. Make sense? And so this is why, as you heard, Leah, in the introduction, I'm striving to build a world filled with emotion scientists as opposed to emotion judges. So ask yourself this: are you someone who accepts all emotions? Do you recognize that, when you're in a bad place, it is temporary? It's not who you are? Are you open and curious and reflective about your own and others' emotions? Do you want to get granular? What I mean by granular is, when you're asking yourself how you're feeling, do you say fine, okay, good, meh? Or do you say, I don't know, is it anger or is it enraged? Is it disappointment or is it hopeless or despair? Is it happy or is it content or is it elated or is it ecstatic? When you fail at regulating your emotions, what's your strategy? Do you say to yourself, this is futile, I'm never going to get good at this? Or, you know what? I can get through this. I'll give you an example. Over the course of the last year, during quarantine, now my dogs are barking in the background. Got to regulate my feelings about that. My mother-in-law was living with us. And long story short is that we thought she was going to live with us for a week, 2 weeks, a month. She came for a wedding back in February. Then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and she was with us for 7 months. And there was one night at dinner where it wasn't going well. I mean, we were getting sick of each other. Never spent so much time with anybody, even my own partner. Nevertheless, my partner's mother. Every day, every meal. And so I was losing it. And then she looked at me and she was like, "Are you really the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence?" And I was like, not tonight. It didn't go so well. And so, anybody else have any of those moments during this pandemic? Come on, be honest with me. So the question is, what do you do in those situations when you just fail? Do you just give up? Or do you kind of get creative and say, all right, what am I learning from this? What can I do from this? That's the growth mindset. The emotion judge looks a little different. Reminds me, I gave a talk to a group of surgeons once. At the end of my presentation, the surgeon looked at me and goes, "What happened to our university?" I was like, "What is going on here right now?" He goes, "This is Yale, Mark. We produce Nobel laureates, not nice people." Okay. Now, how many of you would like to work for someone with that mindset around feelings? What I can tell you is that the people who work for this particular person are miserable. You don't want to work for an emotion judge, right? They're critical, they're closed, they ignore your feelings. It's either you're in a good or bad mood, and it's like, this is how I behave, get over it. It's like my father. My father would say, "Son, this is how I deal with my anger. Deal with it." Okay, Dad, I'll deal with it for 20 years of therapy and a doctorate in psychology. and writing curriculum to teach emotional intelligence. I'm dealing with it, Daddy. So, where are you on this spectrum of emotion scientist to emotion judge? Are you an emotion scientist in some places, an emotion judge in others? So what this tells us is that the skills of emotional intelligence are not these soft skills. They're hard skills. And it may mean that we need to change the reward systems at companies like LinkedIn, Microsoft, around the world to really value these skills, because what research shows is that people who are in the real workforce want people that have these skills, but what they're telling us is that the people who are going to work there don't necessarily have training in them. So now the big question is, what are the skills? We call them the ruler skills. RULER. Recognize, understand, label, express, regulate. Being aware of your own and others' emotions, knowing their causes and consequences, having the words, knowing how and when to express these emotions, having the strategies to regulate them effectively. So here's your big test. What's the difference between anxiety, stress, frustration, and overwhelmed? Anxiety, stress, frustration, overwhelmed. Say it 4 times fast. Do you know the difference? Could you define these? You might not believe this, but I've tried this hundreds of times. Just gave a talk to 100 leaders. What they say? There's no difference. I'm like, there's no difference. It wasn't a trick question. Anxiety is around uncertainty about the future. Stress, having too many demands and not enough resources. Frustration, feeling like your goals are being blocked. Overwhelmed, you're just overcome by emotion. The reason why this is important is that what you might do with these 4 different feeling states could be different based on labeling it accurately. So for years, well, I'll give you an example. When I was going up for tenure as a professor, I was stressed, went to the doctor. Doctor said, here's your Prilosec, here's your Ativan. I'm like, really? Because I had terrible heartburn. He's like, yeah, that's what happens to everybody going up for tenure. I'm like, okay, that's your strategy. And I left there kind of pissed, to be honest. And then I just started reflecting, and I'm like, well, how am I really feeling, Mark? You should know this stuff. And what I realized was my real feeling was overwhelmed. I wasn't stressed. I just had way too much on my plate. I had no freedom. So if you've been experiencing stress during this pandemic, is it anxiety? Is it really stress? Is it frustration? Or is it overwhelmed? Or something else? All right, those are the skills of emotional intelligence. That's that little test of labeling. Ask yourself now, how skilled are you? 1, unskilled. 5, very skilled. Where do you place yourself on the emotional intelligence assessment? 1, I am totally unskilled. 5, come on, I could read someone's facial expression from a mile away. Here's what we know from research. It's a bad question. The correlation between your belief and your actual skill is next to 0. Why might that be the case? It's mostly because we haven't had feedback. My other career is in the martial arts. I have a 5th degree black belt in a martial art called Hapkido. I know I don't look like a tough guy, but I really am. And so much feedback, like yellow belt, how to do the blocks, punches, right? The fancier strikes for the red belts and the black belts. And there's feedback constantly. You spar people and you fall down, you got to get back up and learn how to spar better. Where is that system for emotional intelligence? We've got it for general intelligence, right? You get grades every year, you take tests every year. There's tests to get into universities. We have not developed this adequately for this side of the report card. And how many of you are starting to think, maybe we should give a little bit more attention to emotional intelligence? Well, here's why you should. My last few minutes, and then we're going to jump into some questions. Number 1, you will feel less frustrated at work if you are working with someone who's higher in emotional intelligence. There's about a 40% difference. So your frustration levels are significantly lower at work when your leader is higher in emotional intelligence. Your inspiration is 30 to 40% higher when the leader that you work with is higher in emotional intelligence. Take a look at all these different outcomes. You're more likely to learn skills when you work for someone who's higher in emotional intelligence. You're less likely to have turnover intentions, much higher job satisfaction, lower burnout, more engagement, less fear of speaking up when you have a challenge. You're more comfortable talking to that person. And there's actually, it's a more ethical climate. So when people say, well, should we invest in emotional intelligence? I'm like, just look at the data. If you don't think these data prove that emotional intelligence matters in a workplace, I don't know what to tell you. This is no longer an opinion. This is hard fact. So in my last few minutes, I wanted to share with you some ideas for healthy emotion regulation. Meaning, what do you do with your feelings? The first is you got to give yourself the permission to feel. Other areas, and I talk about these things in my book, are mindful breathing for physiological regulation. When you're really activated, it's very hard to focus, to say positive things to yourself. But we also need to take care of our physical selves. How you sleep, or how much sleep you get, the nutrition that you, things that you eat, and your exercise, all are linked to your healthy emotion regulation. Think about that. Not enough sleep, you're more irritable. Exercise, less irritable. Direct correlation between physical activity, sleep, nutrition, and your ability to regulate emotions. Doing things that you care about, some psychological self-care, building and maintaining healthy relationships, managing your self-talk. How many of you have engaged in self-criticism over the last couple of months? How many of you automatically go from self-criticism to self-compassion? And then what are your routines working? Are they working for you? Or are they working against you? So last couple of slides, the meta moment. Think about this as we transition to our questions. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So emotional intelligence is what you fill that space with, right? We can go from automatic, habitual, often unhelpful ways of dealing with our feelings to conscious, deliberate, effortful strategies that can help us achieve greater well-being and growth. This is my toaster child. This is the meta moment. So we start being aware and sensing our feelings, knowing how to push that pause button so we don't say what's on our mind immediately, taking that breath and seeing what we call our best selves. And through that lens of our best self, we choose and use an effective strategy to manage our emotions and our relationships. Also develop some apps that you can look at. This is called the Mood Meter app. It's downloadable and you can practice with that to build your emotion vocabulary. So some final strategies. One, as I've said, please check out your routines. Is your wake-up time, sleep time working for you? Are you getting those breaks in the afternoon? Can you be a preventionist? Try to surround yourself with people who are calming as opposed to people who activate you. People think venting is helpful. I'm just here to tell you the research says it's not, right? Venting metastasizes, right? It creates more neural networks of all the things that you're complaining about. What it fails to do is help you get the support you need and get the perspective taking that can help you problem solve around it. Beware of emotion contagion. Stressful leaders create stressful organizations. What's interesting about this is that the people who are feeling stress that are working for you will feel stress, but they won't know why, and they won't realize that it's coming from the leader. That's the power of this kind of emotional contagion work. It works, by the way, for pleasant emotions too. I call it being Uncle Marvin. So my Uncle Marvin was that person in my life who gave me the permission to feel, that self-compassion person, that unconditional love person, the empathy. You should know that the mere presence of someone, maybe you've experienced that before, maybe you have someone that you work with or know who just being with them, you feel better. It's like just their presence. Maybe you can be that person for others. Perhaps you can think about your best self, how you want to be seen, how you want to be talked about and experienced. Just write the words down. It's not that hard of an exercise. How I want to be seen, talked about, and experienced. List the words. Put them in your bathroom mirror. Look at them each morning. Enter the day through that lens. And one thing I want to say is that during the pandemic, we've experienced a lot of general empathy, meaning we've, shared with people, our suffering, and people have been kind to us, hopefully. But be mindful that there's something called positive empathy, the ability to share, celebrate, and enjoy others' positive emotions. So find ways to embellish other people's pleasant experiences. It really will make a big difference. And finally, putting it all together. You got to give yourself and everyone you love, even the people you don't love so much, the permission to feel. Right? Strive to be that emotion scientist, not the emotion judge. Remember, this is about accepting all feelings and using them wisely. Please appreciate that this is hard work. It's life's work. Maybe you can be that role model. Be the first to apologize, forgive, even repair, get the help you need. I think we have to not just focus on individuals in our society right now. We've seen, obviously, racism like we've never seen it before, at least in our eyes, on television, and murders that have happened that have really awakened the need to not just focus on individual change, but to think about the systems, whether they be schools, whether it be communities, whether it be companies, states, governments. I think when you think about emotional intelligence as an individual level, you lose the power of it. When you think about creating emotionally intelligent systems, all of a sudden, great things can happen. And lastly, what I want to say is this is hard work. Please don't give up. I think if we can all focus on this other side of the report card for a little while, maybe for the rest of our lives, we can have a healthier and more equitable, innovative, and compassionate society. And on that note, I want to say thank you for inviting me into the LinkedIn world, some resources, and then we're going to jump into Q&A. One is, that's my website, so you can learn more about my book and other things about the center. And then I wanted to share with you the work that we do at OG Life Lab. And you can take a picture of the screen and go to our website and type in friend of Marc at oglifelab.com, and you'll get some free uses of our tool to practice it and try it out. And on that note, thank you so much. I look forward to taking some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marc. This was great. I had a couple laughs. One of them is the not tonight. I also get the same question from my dad. He's like, aren't you the one that studies like learning and development and psychology? And I'm like, not tonight. I'm having a glass of wine tonight. I'm not doing self-improvement. So I love that. We all need permission to do it. I've got a lot of questions and lots of things happening in the chat. So I was watching for you since you couldn't see it. But people engaging, and we loved your toaster child. So love that idea. All right, so I'm going to kick off here with the first one, which is great because it's relevant to what you've been talking about and what we all want, which is, can emotional intelligence be taught, especially in dealing with leaders or individuals who are lacking in that area?
It's a great question, and it's really the motivation for why I co-founded this company called OG Life Lab, because I was giving so many presentations in companies, and they'd say things, well, what's the next step? And I'd say, well, the next step is you can read my book, right? That'll go deeper. But if you really want to learn strategies and like build it, there is training. And I think the most important thing for people to recognize is that the areas of our brain that are responsible for developing these skills are with us forever. Like it's really important to know that. Like you can always improve your emotion vocabulary. Like just today, right? All of a sudden, people who were listening, right? Anxiety, stress, frustrated, overwhelmed. Like, okay, I see the differences there. Well, you added a half a point to your emotional intelligence today. And if you do that for more words, then all of a sudden, right, your brain is more granular in terms of understanding feelings. And then also when it comes to strategies, right? Oh, there's cognitive strategies like reframing, I'll give everybody one of my favorite strategies just because why not? During this pandemic and in life in general, like when I get bad news, maybe you're the same way, Leah. Like when you get bad news, do you ever realize like your whole life just goes like you just like there's nothing, it's like all of a sudden it's over, right? Like
Everything's
you just
terrible. Yeah.
yeah, like everything you go focus in on that one problem, and I call
Yeah.
it getting in the hot air balloon, and you just go in the hot air balloon. You look down and like, oh wait a minute,
Hmm.
my doggies are doing great. My family's doing all right. Like, oh, I'm going to go to the yoga tonight, and I'm going to have a nice meal tonight with a friend, and like, oh, so like it's not all that bad. And so like, I think for many of us, perspective taking is so important. And I think last thing I'll say about this is that one of the reasons why we built our company was to help people not only just learn the tools and strategies, but I think people need coaching to really help them grow. And that feedback is really important. And having someone to work through and give you feedback on your strategies can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. What's you talk about in your podcast with Brene Brown, you mentioned this idea of the power dynamic that happens at work and how some of the people that you work with were even afraid to share their feelings with you, even though you're the director of emotional intelligence. How do we have leaders and people who are in individual contributor roles, although that doesn't make them not leaders, but we have all of them on the call. How do we start to create systems where we can cross some of those hierarchies to share?
Well, that's why I said in my ending, like the systemic piece is so important. Like everybody's got to be working on their emotional intelligence to really get the most outcomes or the best outcomes. But I think, you like Brene Brown's podcast, like what's her big thing? Vulnerability. And so, but vulnerability is not, you can't just be vulnerable, right? Like the challenge with the vulnerability by itself is that it leaves you very exposed. And so, unless you have the skills of emotional intelligence, oftentimes you can put yourself at risk. So, the way I like to think about this is I think it's okay for me to be real with the people I work for. I can share that I'm anxious about things that are happening in society and be transparent about, I was worried about our own, my center is built from revenue from sales of our program. Like, in April, we're like, oh no, who's going to want to go to training? Like, is it going to just fall apart? And I share that with you because I was scared. But so the question is, how do I share my feelings without making everybody think, oh my God, I got to look for another job? And so that's the trick, right? It's like, oh, if Mark thinks it's going to fall apart, then we better run now. And I think there's ways of sharing our feelings, but also sharing that we have plans for dealing with our feelings. It's like parents. Like if you only tell your kid that you're happy all the time, that's weird, right? Like you got to share with your kid that you experience the range, but you can also say, but daddy's working on got so mad at his friend today at work and I've been thinking about it. And here's what I'm going to say tomorrow. And so you're showing, right, as a leader or as a parent that you have feelings, but you have really helpful ways of dealing with them.
So we show some cards, but we also show many cards, and we also then give the plan to move forward so that it's reinforcing confidence, but still showing vulnerability.
Openness, transparency, authenticity, coupled with I'm working on it. I have strategies to deal with it. They want to, because that's the psychological safety that people want to have at work, right? They don't want to feel like their leader is anxious and unskilled at dealing with it. They want to feel like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one who feels anxious. Oh, thank goodness. And I have a leader who actually cares about this and who is demonstrating helpful strategies to regulate it. So I can actually be more like him or her as opposed to be left on my own to figure out how to deal with my feelings.
There is I've been using the mood meter for, the mood meter app, which I would highly recommend to everybody. Really easy, powerful tool to be able to figure out where you are and then map out where you are over time. So if you're always in the blue at work, maybe we should think about that, right? If you're always in the green, that's fantastic, or maybe not fantastic. I don't know. There's a range at all times. So it's been a really powerful way for me to understand the moods beyond, the like mad, sad, happy, glad. idea. And at the same time, there's an interesting question here that someone's posed, which is curious to hear from a cultural perspective. When it comes to comfort talking about emotions, how do you think about or research through those differences? For example, I know my own experience being a Black woman in the Black community, it's not as discussed in the same way, or there's an expectation that we, kind of tough things out. I wonder what you've seen with that and how you think about us moving forward as a culturally diverse environment.
So I think approaching it through the lens of the emotion scientists, right, is the safe way to go, right? The emotion scientist is saying, Leah, tell me how you're feeling now. Right? Like that's a little bit much. The emotion judge is like, I don't care how she's feeling. You don't want to go there either. So I think it's, the more I can get to know you as a person who works with me, right, the more I'm able to see, like really learn your facial expressions, learn your body language, understand what makes you feel the way you feel, find the ways to communicate with you that feel safe and comfortable for you to talk about your feelings. And so this is not like it's not like a textbook. This is not like math. It's not like 2 + 2 = 4. It's I got to get to beneath the surface of the people I work with. Like I've only begun to know you, but you've shared more. Like I could probably tell if you're outgoing or shy, like whatever. It's not going to really drive much. I kind of get that you're interested in this kind of stuff because this is what you do for work. But do I know, you, the person? No, not yet. That takes time. And so like building relationships with people is a way to understand their feelings, which then provides you with the opportunities to understand how to work with them. And I think importantly, what everyone should know is that the way you feel about things and the strategies that you use to regulate, we don't want to project those onto anybody, whether it be about someone who looks like us or doesn't look like us, right? What we want to find out when we're working with people is what their needs are. And then once I understand their needs, I can help them find the strategies that work best for them. That was
That's
a lot.
Great point. I think there's a balance of, recognizing cultural differences, but also understanding that people have their own individual needs and desires. And one thing that came up for me as you're talking about this is, we're in this, the number one word people have used over the last year is they're anxious, right? So we're in this crazy world where, leaders are anxious, right? They're dealing with the anxiety. And what I'm seeing, particularly at, at LinkedIn, but everywhere else, is this ask now for leaders to lean in even more, right? And they're sort of like, where am I supposed to get the energy from this already empty and anxious reservoir? And so I'm curious, like, how would you, or what would you say to those people who are feeling like, oh my gosh, I have the hard skills, I have the soft skills, now you're asking me to develop the inner skills and the human skills to show up even more?
I would say, like, what's the alternative to not doing it? The people are imploding, at home. People, think about it. If I was doing another webinar for a different organization, this guy was there, and I said, he was asking, he said, Mark, I'm a father, I'm a lawyer, I'm now my son's teacher, I'm also the tech coordinator, I'm also the cafeteria worker, I'm the custodian. It's like, I never thought emotional intelligence was important, but like now I really need this stuff. And so I think emotions always have a seat at the table, whether it's the boardroom, whether it's in a meeting, whether it's at home at the kitchen table. People's feelings are with them everywhere they go. As I said earlier, how we feel drives our attention, our decisions, our relationships, our health, and our performance. So the more we can just acknowledge that's the case, the more we can be positive role models for how to manage our emotions in helpful ways, the better everyone's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe it's the story we're making up is that it might take more from us, but the reality is we can actually fill up our cup because it's already there. The emotions are already there. It's just getting better.
Now, and I think one thing that people oftentimes think is like with like the mood meter, like, so I got to check in on the mood meter like 50 times a day. I'm like, no, that's when you're psychiatrically hospitalized. You don't do that, right? You don't want to do that. it's like, it just becomes like part of your life. You're just checking in, like as you transition to a meeting, like, oh God, like that last meeting didn't go so well. Kind of irritated with that. I don't want to let that affect me here. Let me think about how I want to feel here. It's just basically this like wave that you live with, but that you're just more aware of and trying to use wisely.
Mm. So it feels like an integration. Okay, so our next question is, what is the best antidote? Yeah, this is always a scary one for me. The best antidote for stress and anxiety to keep itself from manifesting physically, right? It's like if I'm always stressed and I'm going, oh my God, now someone's talking about metastasization, and say that 10 times fast. How do I keep that from happening?
Well, firstly, as I said a little while ago, there is no best strategy. Like, we just got to know that.
Fair.
It's like what works best for you, given your context, given your cultural background. And that's where culture comes in as well, right? So Marc Brackett is not the knower of what you should do. Marc Brackett has a lot of strategies that I can offer to you to select the ones that will work best for you. With that said, I do have my favorites. And so I'll just share those. The first is just basic breathing exercises. You know, whether it be counting your breaths, whether it be a mantra where you're doing something like, I learned one from a very famous Zen master called Thich Nhat Hanh, where you say the word in and the word out and the word deep and the word slow and then the word calm and then the word ease. And then you put a little smile on your face and you say release. And so, for example, when I struggle falling asleep because of anxiety, I just repeat that and then boom, I'm out. Because what happens with our brains when we're feeling stressed and anxious is that we go into either fight mode, flight mode, freeze mode, or we go into a rumination kind of place where we're like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? That's the brain that activates the nervous system, that creates cortisol, that creates lots of bad things for our bodies and minds. So when we can breathe and deactivate, right, we can lower the temperature, which can help us then use those helpful cognitive strategies. So breathing exercises really do work very well to help people deactivate. I will say that the second strategy that I recommend is just monitoring your self-talk. So for example, there was a point, you know, remember last April where like the stock market dropped 1,000 points, no 2,000 points, no 5,000 points. I'm like, oh my goodness, like I'm going to be 117 before I can retire. And you know, I was freaking out about everything. And then I like sat and I took my breaths. And I'm like, all right, Mark, how much control do you have over the stock market? Like, there's nothing I'm going to do about it. I'm going to run around the world. Like, I can cry for hours. I can like, you know, tell everybody in my family, like, please, will you save me if I lose all my finances? Da, da, da. But like, that's like endlessly wasting time on something that I have zero control over. So I think the more you can ask yourself and focus on the things that you have control over, the healthier you're going to be.
Self-talk and breathing. I've been using your Thich Nhat Hanh since I read it and love it.
Well, and also, you know, what's important is that, I don't know about you, but for me, because I was terribly bullied in school, being Jewish, growing up where I grew up, being gay, like there was a lot for people to say that was mean and cruel to me. And I have a lot of years of experience digesting meanness and cruelty, and a lot of negative self-talk as a result of it, right? Because I just, maybe I am this, maybe I am that. You're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too dark, you're too short, you're too this, you're too this. You know what I'm talking about. And that's just stewing in my brain for years. And then this positive self-talk, it's like, well, what's that? Like self-compassion? Huh? I don't have any practice with that. So what happens, I think, for many of us, especially for those of us who had challenges in life, is that our automatic is the negative self-talk. So we've got to spend time unlearning the self-criticism, learning the self-compassion, and then practicing it for the rest of our lives. And so it's work. But let me tell you, as someone who is now like 51 and like really working on it, it does help. But it's a big part of my life is just monitoring that and like saying, all right, that's not working. Be the emotion scientist about the strategy. Does that make sense? Like, wait a minute, this negative self-talk is not helpful. Let me figure out a way to convert that to self-compassion, which is actually much more helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard you say this twice, and it's something I think about too, which is this is the simple but not easy work of our lives. Like, we own this. Yeah. And it's a game changer.
It's like monitoring your weight. It's like brushing your teeth, right? It's like you got to do it every day. You got to, it's part of who we are. Let's treat it that way.
All right, maybe one more question. And for those of you who are LinkedIn, we're going to share the link in here so you can get your feedback in. We'd love to hear it. I want to end on a light note, but I do want to ask this one, Marc. How do you deal with someone who doesn't buy into the concept of dealing with emotions and refuses to do so?
You eliminate them. No, kidding.
The eject button.
Exactly. Gosh, there are some people though, right? One is, I always say that I like to teach people through my heart and through my role as a scientist. And so like for managers and leaders that are like naysayers, I just go to the data and say, look at this. Like, you got to see these data. Like, it's powerful, like inspiration, 50% difference, burnout, job turnover intentions. Like these are going to really affect the bottom line of our organization. So you got to take this seriously. And I just think like reminding people that this is hard science that is proven to make a difference in the bottom line of a company and in relationships and in mental and physical health. You just keep on saying it, and hopefully you can get them to convert over.
And if they don't, you have the like advent calendar for the eject button.
Oh, I have a strategy for that. Around people, there's another good strategy. Last strategy is that like for people who are like driving me out of my mind, it's called psychological distancing. And so what I do is I pretend they're a TV show. And I'm like, gosh, this is like a really terrible TV show. And so I separate myself from them when they're activating me. I'm like, I'm not really in the room with you. This is like, I'm watching this bad movie. And at least it works to not like affect me personally. And that gives me also the time to think about like, all right, how am I going to deal with this person? But again, the more you know people, right? It's hard to not like someone when you really know their story. And so like get to know that person's story and find a way in. And I think that's the magic of emotional intelligence also. Maybe it's through the leadership, maybe it's through parenting, maybe it's through mental health, maybe it's through decision making. Like be creative in finding which aspect of emotional intelligence is going to resonate most and kind of use that as your entry point.
Awesome. Yeah, you reminded me of I'm rereading Braving the Wilderness by Brene Brown, and the chapter I was just listening to is it's hard to hate close up, move in. And that just stuck with me when I first heard it. I was like, shoot, she's right. Yeah. I got to move in. All right. So we're a minute over. Just a quick ask for you, Marc, for people who joined today, if there was one thing they needed to walk away with to make this impactful for them, I'm sure there's a million, but what would you want that to be?
I think it's, giving themselves the permission to feel, because I think that's the starting point for all of us, to not be these critical judges of our feelings and to be open to experiencing all emotions. There's no such thing as a bad emotion. Our emotions are experiences that we all have, and we live on a roller coaster ride, and just enjoy the ride and use those emotions wisely, as opposed to letting them interfere, with your well-being and growth.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone who came, Marc Brackett, director and founder of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. You can find him on marcbrackett.com. You will hear more from him. He's going to be joining our podcast In the Arena. the LinkedIn podcast in a few months. So we'll be talking more about Marc's story, which is incredible. If you have a chance to pick up Permission to Feel, fantastic. And for those of you internal to LinkedIn, when we collect your information, we'll be sending out books to a number of you as well. Thank you, Marc. Thank you to everyone else. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thank you so much for inviting me in.